The old mansion sat on a quiet street, grand and silent. Its walls were tall, painted in soft cream with golden trims that glimmered faintly under the afternoon sun. From the outside, it looked like a place of endless wealth, filled with treasures and laughter. But inside, the house had a rhythm of its own, one that most people never noticed. It whispered with every creaking floorboard, with every soft breeze through the tall windows, with every echo of footsteps that went unheard. For many, it was just a place of work or a place to visit for parties. But for her, it was something more complicated. She had worked there for many years. The house called her its caretaker, though her real work was much more than cleaning. She kept the floors polished so that sunlight reflected softly against them. She arranged the flowers in the vases, making sure each petal faced the right way, though she often caught herself wondering if anyone actually noticed. She dusted the high shelves where priceless artifacts sat untouched for decades. She unlocked and locked doors, repaired small problems, and remembered details no one else did: the temperature of the wine cellar, the order of the silverware in the drawers, the rhythm of the clocks that ticked in each room. Most days people barely saw her. She moved quietly, a shadow among the grand furniture and sparkling chandeliers. Guests came and went, some polite, some careless, some laughing loudly as though the house existed only for their entertainment. They greeted her with a nod, or sometimes not at all. It was easy to be invisible when you chose to be, and she had learned early that invisibility kept her safe. But there was one place in the mansion that made her feel less invisible than anywhere else: the piano room. It was a small space compared to the rest of the house, but it held a kind of magic. The piano itself was old, polished dark wood that reflected her face when she leaned over it. The keys were ivory, worn slightly in the center from decades of use. The instrument had belonged to the family for generations. When it played, the notes floated through the house like delicate smoke, touching every corner and filling it with feeling. The caretaker had never been told to play it. She had never been asked to play, and yet she often found herself standing near it, brushing her fingers lightly over the keys. Feeling the cool smoothness beneath her fingertips, her love for music had started long before she became a caretaker. She had learned to play as a child, spending hours at a small piano in a modest home far away. Music had been her escape, her joy, her secret world. She remembered the days when her small hands could barely reach the keys, but the melodies came out anyway. She remembered the quiet applause from neighbors who didn't know how deeply they were encouraging her. She remembered the day she played for the first time in front of a crowd, a simple tune that made her parents smile with pride. But life had not stayed gentle. Responsibilities, circumstances, and survival had pushed her away from that world. The piano she loved became a distant dream, tucked away behind other duties and worries, and yet here in this mansion, she sometimes felt that dream stir again. She would stand in the piano room during quiet hours, alone with the sun streaming through the tall windows, and imagine the notes escaping her fingers, drifting into the rooms beyond. The piano waited patiently, silent but inviting, as if it remembered her from long ago. She could almost hear the music she used to play, delicate and haunting, like a memory brushing against the edges of her mind. Despite her years in the mansion, she never expected anyone to notice her love for music. Guests rarely saw her, and the family who owned the house treated her with polite distance. They relied on her presence, on her careful attention to detail, but they did not truly see her. And she did not seek recognition. She had long learned that the world often missed the quiet, the careful, the patient. She had learned that power and wealth often drowned out gentle voices and soft footsteps. But that didn't make her presence less real. It didn't make her memories or her passions less alive. Her routine was steady, almost ritualistic. Each morning she would walk through the halls, checking doors, wiping dust, arranging the flowers. She would pause at the piano, even if only for a moment, running her fingers along the smooth surface as if to say hello. Then she would continue her work, polishing, cleaning, straightening, all without complaint. She rarely spoke to the guests, though sometimes she exchanged polite nods. Some people assumed her quiet nature meant she was timid or shy or unimportant. They were wrong. There was strength in her silence, a kind of resilience built from years of navigating a world that often overlooked her. Sometimes she would overhear snippets of conversation. Guests gossiping or boasting about wealth or talent. She would hear laughter, sometimes cruel, sometimes careless, but she rarely let it touch her. She had learned that the world often misunderstood quiet people. But she also noticed things others did not, the small details of a person's character. The subtle shifts in a room when someone entered or left. The patterns in the way people treated objects, spaces, and each other. She knew more about the house and the people in it than anyone realized, and that knowledge gave her a quiet power, one that did not need to be spoken. Evenings were her favorite. When the day's work was done and the house grew quiet, she would sometimes allow herself to linger near the piano. She would close her eyes and imagine the notes rising from the keys, filling the room, filling the house, filling her heart. It was a secret ritual, private and safe. The sunlight through the tall windows would cast long shadows, and in that space, she could almost pretend the world was different, that music could speak where words could not, that silence could carry meaning, that she could matter without needing anyone's approval. Her life as a caretaker had taught her patience. She had seen how fleeting attention could be, how quickly people forgot those who served them, how easily applause could be given and taken away. She understood that the world favored the bold and the loud. Yet she also knew the value of quiet presence, of consistent effort, of unseen care. She understood that moments of greatness often arrived unexpectedly, and that when they did, they could change everything. She did not know it yet, but such a moment was approaching. Something would happen that would bring the piano, her past, and her hidden talent into the center of attention. She could not imagine it, could not anticipate it. All she knew was that she would continue her work, continue her routine, continue to live quietly in a world that often ignored her. And all the while, the piano waited, patient and silent, ready to tell its story in her hands. For now, she moved through the halls, dusting, cleaning, straightening, unnoticed. She smiled at the small things she loved, the way sunlight caught the chandeliers, the scent of fresh flowers, the soft creak of the wooden floors. She paused at the piano, brushing her fingers along the keys, and let herself dream just a little. And though no one else could hear it, music lived in her heart. Waiting for the day it would return to the world, the house buzzed with activity that evening. The grand hall was filled with people in sparkling dresses and tailored suits, their laughter echoing against the tall ceilings. Glasses clinked, voices overlapped, and the air smelled of perfume and expensive cologne. The caretaker moved quietly through the crowd, unseen and unremarkable. She carried trays, straightened chairs, and refilled glasses. Her movements precise, practiced, invisible. It was a skill she had mastered over years, being everywhere, yet nowhere, present, yet unnoticed. She often paused near the piano, tucked into a corner of the room, its dark wood gleaming under the chandeliers. Guests barely paid it any attention, some glancing at it as a backdrop for photographs or ignoring it entirely. The caretaker's fingers brushed lightly over the keys, a habit she could not resist. The keys were smooth and cool beneath her fingers, and she could almost feel the music waiting there, patient, untouched, ready to speak when the moment came. The evening went on. Waiters moved through the crowd, offering champagne and appetizers. While the rich and powerful laughed at jokes and stories that only they found funny, she noticed how the guests looked at each other, the subtle competition in their smiles, the careful way they tried to impress without appearing to try. She had grown used to it. She had grown used to being invisible. She had grown used to carrying out her duties without anyone seeing the effort behind them. Then he arrived. He was a man of wealth, confidence, and presence. His smile was wide, his laughter loud, and his eyes scanned the room with the curiosity of someone who believed the world existed for his amusement. He noticed her immediately, standing quietly near the piano, her hands resting briefly on the keys before she pulled them back as if embarrassed by her own longing. He tilted his head, observing her, amused by her stillness, by the way she seemed both present and absent at the same time. With a grin, he leaned toward a few friends and said in a tone meant to draw attention, "Watch this. Let's see if the caretaker can do more than carry trays." He gestured toward her, laughing lightly, as if daring her to respond. The crowd near him chuckled, curious, expecting a joke or a refusal. Not knowing the story about to unfold, the caretaker felt her heart skip a beat. She had been noticed before, of course, but never like this. Never with eyes that seemed to weigh her worth like a coin to be judged. She straightened, steadying herself, hoping the moment would pass without incident. But it did not. He stepped closer, louder this time, drawing attention from the nearby guests. "Play something," he said, his voice teasing, "and I'll marry you." The words hung in the air, meant as a joke, light, careless, but sharp enough to cut. The room erupted with laughter. Some laughed politely, some guffawed at the audacity, and a few exchanged looks of discomfort. No one expected her to respond. Most assumed she would simply step away, embarrassed, her quiet life continuing without interruption. The caretaker froze. For a moment, she felt the old instincts rise, the instinct to stay invisible, to avoid attention, to move quietly and let the world pass by. But something inside her stirred, a small flame of resolve. She had spent years watching people assume her silence meant weakness. She had spent decades carrying out her work without recognition, enduring jokes and dismissals without complaint. And she had spent even longer carrying a secret talent. A passion she had not abandoned, only set aside. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The laughter around her became a blur, and for the first time that evening, she saw the piano not as a piece of furniture, not as a silent witness, but as a companion. Its presence was strong, patient, waiting. And she realized that this moment, humiliating as it began, could be something entirely different if she chose. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped toward the piano. The crowd noticed the movement and paused, their laughter faltering into curiosity. She did not rush. She did not hurry. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who had waited years for a single moment, even if she did not know it at the time. As she approached, the wealthy man's grin faltered slightly. He expected embarrassment, a quick refusal, perhaps a nervous shuffle. He did not expect this calm, measured approach. The room began to quiet, an unconscious shift as people sensed something unusual in the air. Conversation stopped mid-word, glasses paused halfway to lips, and eyes turned toward the piano. She sat down on the bench. Her back was straight, her hands hovering above the keys for a brief moment as if acknowledging the piano's presence. The man who had joked leaned forward, smirking slightly, expecting a humorous note or a clumsy attempt. He did not notice the subtle change in her posture, the way she exhaled slowly, releasing tension. There was a silence, not awkward, but anticipatory. Then she pressed the first key. It was soft, almost hesitant, but perfectly in tune. The sound floated through the room, delicate, intimate, unexpected. The wealthy man blinked. The guests shifted in their chairs. The note seemed simple, but it carried weight. A quiet power that filled the corners of the hall. She continued, slowly at first, letting her fingers find the melody within her mind. The notes were clear, controlled, expressive. They told a story without words, a story of patience, of hidden talent, of years lived quietly, yet fully in thought and emotion. The music wrapped around the room like a gentle wind, moving past chandeliers and walls, brushing against faces, touching hearts. People were captivated. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago vanished, replaced by attention, awe, and something that resembled reverence. The wealthy man's eyes widened. He had expected a joke, a failure, a moment of entertainment. Instead, he faced skill, emotion, and depth. The caretaker's playing was not just music. It was a statement. It was proof that she was more than anyone had ever believed, more than the world had allowed her to show. Some guests tried to look away, embarrassed by their own earlier assumptions. Others could not move, rooted to their seats, listening as the notes flowed seamlessly, effortlessly, though the effort behind them was immense. The music carried a sense of longing, of dreams deferred, of strength found in silence. It was as if her entire life, every unnoticed day, every quiet action, every small act of care had led to this moment. The wealthy man's smile disappeared. He was speechless, caught in a realization he had not expected. His words, meant as a joke, had been met not with embarrassment or fear, but with quiet power and undeniable talent. He had challenged her, made light of her presence, and in doing so, had awakened something that no joke could diminish. The caretaker's eyes remained closed, focused entirely on the music, on the story she was telling through each note. She did not play for applause or approval. She played for herself, for the piano, for the years of quiet patience that had brought her to this point. And yet the effect on the room was undeniable. Guests who had barely noticed her before now saw her in a new light, a light they had not expected to find in a woman they thought they knew. As the final notes of her initial melody lingered in the air, there was a pause, a moment of silence that felt heavier than any applause could ever be. The caretaker lifted her hands from the keys, gently, as if leaving the piano with a promise to return. She opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of the wealthy man for the first time since the joke. There was no anger, no prideful glare, no boastful triumph. There was only calm dignity, a quiet strength that spoke louder than any words could. The room remained silent. It's the kind of silence that carries understanding, respect, and sometimes shame. People were processing what they had just witnessed. The wealthy man struggled to form words, to salvage some control over the moment. He had expected amusement, and instead, he had encountered a lesson in humility, talent, and quiet power. The caretaker stood slowly, her movements measured and graceful. She did not speak. She did not look for praise. She simply returned to her duties, carrying trays, straightening chairs, and moving through the room as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in the room had felt the extraordinary. From that moment on, the quiet caretaker was no longer invisible. She had been seen, truly seen, in a way that would linger far longer than any joke, far longer than any party. And though the evening continued with chatter, laughter, and movement, the memory of those first notes, their depth, their emotion, their quiet command remained, suspended in the air. A reminder that some moments, some talents, and some people are not to be underestimated. The room was still. Not just quiet, but suspended, as if the music itself had pulled time out of the world and held it in place. The notes she played were no longer tentative. They flowed with a confidence that seemed to come from years of waiting, years of silence, and years of hidden strength. Her fingers moved over the keys with grace, precision, and emotion. Each note carried a story, one that was personal yet universal, touching memories, regrets, and dreams in the hearts of everyone present. People who had been laughing moments ago now sat upright. Leaning forward, eyes fixed on her hands as they danced over the ivory keys, she did not look at them. She did not seek their approval. She only felt the music, letting it rise naturally from her heart, filling the room, filling herself. The wealthy man who had made the joke felt a shift within him. At first, he had been amused, confident that this would be nothing more than a moment of entertainment. But as the music continued, he realized it was more than entertainment. It was a revelation. It was proof that he had underestimated her, proof that her quiet life had contained layers of skill, passion, and depth that he could not have imagined. He watched, silently, as every note seemed to weave a story that went far beyond the walls of the room. Guests whispered among themselves, not wanting to break the spell. A few covered their mouths as if afraid a sound might disturb the delicate atmosphere. Others sat motionless, captivated. Some felt a lump in their throats, emotions rising unexpectedly at the purity and power of her playing. It was a rare moment where money, status, and laughter meant nothing, and only the truth of her music mattered. The caretaker's playing grew more complex. She moved from gentle, lilting melodies to notes that struck with intensity, passion, and resolve. It was not a performance aimed at impressing anyone. She was not performing for praise, applause, or recognition. She was performing because this was a moment that demanded honesty. A moment where her life's hidden story could speak through sound. As the music swelled, the room seemed to change. The chandeliers sparkled brighter, the walls absorbed the sound and reflected it back, and the very air felt charged. Every guest became part of the story she was telling, whether they realized it or not. They felt her journey years of quiet work, unnoticed effort, longing for expression, and the courage to step forward when the world least expected it. The wealthy man's pride gave way to something unfamiliar: humility. He had teased, he had joked, he had assumed he knew her place. Now he realized he had been wrong. The woman he had considered invisible was commanding the attention of everyone in the room without a word. He could not interrupt, could not laugh, could not dismiss what was happening. All he could do was watch and listen, a feeling of awe creeping into his chest. The caretaker did not rush. She allowed each note to resonate, to breathe, to linger. She let the pauses in the music carry meaning, letting silence speak where words could not. It was a skill born of patience, of understanding the weight of sound, of knowing that the space between notes could hold as much power as the notes themselves. A few guests exchanged glances, realizing they had misjudged her. They had assumed her silence meant timidity or lack of talent. Now they understood that silence had been her shield, her method of survival, and her way of carrying her life with dignity. The music was a revelation, a reminder that true strength often lies beneath the surface. Waiting for the right moment to emerge, the caretaker's expression remained calm. Her eyes were focused, but not on the audience. They were on the piano, on the story she was telling, on the emotions she wanted to convey. There was no arrogance in her demeanor, no desire to prove superiority. She only wanted to express what had long been kept inside. And as she did, the room responded not with applause yet, but with a shared understanding that something extraordinary was happening. Even the wealthy man began to feel the depth of the moment. He had always been surrounded by people who flattered him, who laughed at his jokes, who reinforced his sense of control. But here in this room, his control was gone. She had seized the attention without aggression, without demand, simply through the power of her talent. He could feel a mix of admiration, shame, and surprise welling within him. The music shifted again, this time softer, more introspective. The notes spoke of loneliness, of years of being unseen, of longing for a place in the world where she could simply exist without judgment. The guests listened, moved in ways they could not articulate, as if the music were reaching into their own experiences, touching memories they had long forgotten. Some felt tears prick their eyes, while others simply sat in quiet awe. No one had expected this. The evening had begun as a casual social gathering, full of laughter, boasting, and light conversation. But now, the room was transformed. The music had taken over, making wealth, status, and jokes irrelevant. For the first time, everyone saw her not as a caretaker, not as an invisible presence, not as someone to overlook, but as a person of depth, talent, and grace. The wealthy man wanted to speak, to recover his pride, to say something clever or dismissive. But every time he opened his mouth, the music held him in place. He realized that words were unnecessary here, that the notes themselves were far more powerful than anything he could say. She had silenced the room not through confrontation, but through mastery, emotion, and the courage to step forward when it mattered most. Her fingers moved with precision and elegance, yet they also carried warmth, softness, and humanity. Each key press seemed to tell a piece of her story, the struggles she had faced, the dreams she had held on to, the patience she had cultivated, and the strength she had discovered in silence. The audience could not help but feel connected to her, even if they had just met her moments ago. Some guests whispered quietly to one another, trying to understand the woman before them. "I had no idea she could play like this," one said, voice low. "All this time, she's been right here, unnoticed." Another nodded, eyes still fixed on her hands. "It's like she's telling her life through the music." The caretaker played on, undistracted by the whispers. She let the music swell, let the room absorb every note. There was no rush, no showmanship, no attempt to impress. Only honesty, clarity, and depth. She had waited her whole life for moments like this. Even if she did not know it, the wealthy man felt a mix of guilt and admiration. He had made a careless joke, assuming she would either ignore it or fail. Instead, he found himself confronted with undeniable talent, dignity, and courage. He realized he had underestimated the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the people who lived their lives without seeking attention. And now he was forced to acknowledge that those same people could command a room with nothing more than truth, presence, and skill. Time seemed to stretch. The music carried on, each note more compelling than the last. The audience leaned in, unable to look away, unable to think of anything but the sound, the emotion, and the story being told. The caretaker was no longer just a woman playing the piano. She was a force, a presence that could not be ignored, a living testament to patience, resilience, and hidden talent. As the final notes of this section of the piece lingered in the air, the room held its breath. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with awe, understanding, and unspoken respect. The caretaker slowly lifted her hands from the keys, allowing the echoes to fade naturally. She did not look at the audience. She did not seek validation. She simply allowed the music to rest. Knowing she had said what she needed to say, the wealthy man remained frozen, his earlier confidence replaced with humility. He had been taught a lesson he would not forget. The caretaker had shown that true talent, true strength, and true presence could not be diminished by jokes, assumptions, or status. She had proven that the quiet, overlooked, and underestimated could rise to moments of greatness, and that when they did, they left an impact that could not be erased. And in that room, filled with people who had come for an evening of leisure, conversation, and entertainment, one woman had reminded them all of something important, that talent and courage often reside in unexpected places. And that respect is earned not through wealth or social standing, but through honesty, presence, and the courage to show the world who you truly are. The room had grown utterly still. Every conversation had faded into the background. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, even the subtle rustle of dresses and suits-all had disappeared, leaving nothing but the music and the presence of the caretaker at the piano. Her fingers moved over the keys with a confidence and purpose that filled the space with sound and emotion. She did not play to impress, did not play to entertain. She played to speak the language of her life, the language of her heart, the language of years lived quietly in service, in patience, and in waiting. The wealthy man who had made the joke earlier now sat frozen in his seat, his eyes fixed on her hands. The smirk he had worn, the pride he had felt, the laughter he had expected, all were gone. In their place was something unfamiliar, something humbling, awe. He had thought he could control the moment, could dictate its course with a joke, could assert his status with charm. Now he realized that the world had its own rhythm, and she had found it, guiding it with her music. Each note she played was deliberate, shaped with care, yet flowing effortlessly from her fingers. The melody shifted, rising and falling like a tide, carrying the weight of joy, sorrow, hope, and longing. Guests who had arrived for a party now felt themselves swept into a profound experience, one that demanded attention, reflection, and emotional engagement. They were no longer passive observers. They were participants in a story told without words, yet understood completely through the resonance of each note. Some of the older guests, who had lived their lives with privilege and familiarity, felt a stir in their hearts they did not expect. They had seen many performances, many displays of skill and talent, yet nothing compared to this. It was not just the music, it was the presence of the woman behind it. She carried years of resilience, strength, and unseen effort in every keystroke. Her calm, quiet demeanor hid a fire that now burned through the room. Children in the audience, often restless at gatherings, sat mesmerized. Their eyes were wide, their faces soft, and they leaned toward the piano as if drawn by a force beyond their understanding. Even they felt the story, the emotions, the sincerity embedded in her performance. They did not need to comprehend every note. They simply knew that something extraordinary was happening before them. The wealthy man shifted in his seat. He wanted to speak, to regain control, to make a joke, to distract the room with humor, but he could not. The music held him, bound him with its clarity, its depth, and its honesty. He realized with growing discomfort that he had underestimated her, underestimated the quiet, the invisible, the unnoticed. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that such people often carry within them a strength and depth that the world fails to see until they choose to reveal it. The caretaker's hands moved faster now, yet with perfect control. The notes danced through the room like sparks, lighting up emotions that had long been dormant. There was a rhythm that felt like breathing, a cadence that felt like heartbeat, and a flow that felt like the passage of life itself. She had not intended to capture anyone's attention, yet she had captured every eye, every mind, every heart. People were leaning forward unconsciously, hanging on the movement of her fingers, listening not just to the music but to the woman who created it. Every chord she struck carried memory, meaning, and emotion. She played with vulnerability, showing that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it moves silently beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She let the music swell with emotion, rising and falling like waves, and the room seemed to expand. Holding the sound, holding the feeling, holding the impact of her presence, some guests could feel tears welling in their eyes. They had come expecting an evening of social games, polite conversation, and trivial amusement. Yet here they were, profoundly moved by the quiet power of a woman they had overlooked. There was no judgment in her playing, no desire to shame anyone. She only allowed the truth of her talent and her life to speak through the piano. And that truth resonated with everyone in the room, leaving an impression that would linger long after the music ended. The wealthy man found himself examining his own behavior. He had been careless with words, arrogant in thought, and quick to mock. Now he faced the consequences, not in anger, not in conflict, but in the undeniable truth of her skill and presence. He could no longer assume dominance, could no longer laugh off moments, could no longer expect that people or things would bend to his expectations. The music was a lesson, subtle yet powerful. And he could feel it deep within him. Guests whispered softly among themselves, though only a few dared to break the spell completely. "She is incredible," one said, voice trembling slightly. "I had no idea," another added, shaking their head in disbelief. People who had spent years surrounded by wealth and influence were humbled by the sheer honesty and brilliance of someone who had lived in the shadows. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that talent, patience, and authenticity could not be bought or mocked. They could only be experienced, felt, and respected. The caretaker shifted her melody again, this time slower, more contemplative. Each note seemed to carry a lifetime of emotions, regret, longing, joy, sorrow, and hope, all intertwined. It was as if she were telling her story without words, inviting the audience to listen, to feel, to understand. And they did. They listened with their entire beings, sensing the years of quiet work, the sacrifices, the patience, and the resilience that had led her to this moment. The piano itself seemed to respond to her. Its tones were rich, deep and resonant, amplifying the emotion she infused into every keystroke. The room became a living thing, breathing with the rhythm of her playing, vibrating with the energy of her presence. Guests felt connected to each other in ways they had not anticipated, sharing a moment of genuine humanity that transcended status, wealth, or social hierarchy. The wealthy man watched, unable to look away. He saw the depth of her skill, the precision of her technique, and the emotion behind every note. He realized that he had not just misjudged her talent, but her entire being. He had assumed that visibility equaled importance, that wealth equaled control, and that jokes could define reality. Now he understood how wrong he had been. The caretaker had shown that true power and influence do not come from loud words or public recognition. They come from quiet strength, consistent effort, and authentic presence. Some guests were on the verge of tears, moved by the honesty and beauty of the performance. They had been caught up in the frivolity of social life, yet here was something genuine, raw, and unforgettable. They realized that the caretaker, someone they had barely noticed before, was capable of commanding the attention, emotion, and respect of everyone in the room without demanding it. The caretaker continued, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys. The notes carried a message not just of skill, but of life experience. They spoke of being overlooked, of perseverance, of holding on to dreams when the world seemed to ignore them. She expressed more than just music. She expressed herself, her story, and her humanity. And everyone in the room felt it. The wealthy man, who had intended to amuse himself at her expense, felt an unfamiliar sense of humility. He had expected a performance that would be light, trivial, and entertaining. Instead, he was faced with an undeniable display of talent, depth, an emotion that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the people around him. About power and about judgment, the caretaker's music became more expressive, more emotional, more alive. It was as if the piano had become an extension of herself, translating her life experiences into sound. The audience, completely silent, could feel the story behind each note, the years of quiet work, the sacrifices, the dreams deferred, and the patience required to endure unnoticed. And in that silence, they felt something shift inside themselves. A recognition of talent and humanity that they had previously overlooked. As the music reached its emotional peak, the room seemed to hold its breath. Guests were on the edge of their seats, leaning forward, holding back tears, and feeling a profound sense of awe. They had been witnesses to something rare and transformative. The caretaker had not sought recognition, she had not demanded attention, yet she had captured the hearts and minds of everyone in the room. Finally, as the last note faded, the silence lingered. It was a silence heavy with emotion, with understanding, and with unspoken respect. The caretaker lifted her hands from the keys, her posture calm and dignified. She did not look for applause, she did not speak, she did not seek approval. She simply allowed the room to absorb the impact of her presence and her performance. For the wealthy man, for the guests, and for anyone who had doubted her before, the message was clear. The caretaker had shown that talent, courage, and dignity are not determined by status or visibility. She had demonstrated that quiet strength, patience, and authenticity could command attention and respect more effectively than arrogance or wealth ever could. The room remained still, suspended in that moment of realization. Even after she walked away from the piano, the echoes of her performance lingered, a reminder that the quiet, unnoticed, and underestimated can leave an indelible mark when they choose to step forward. And in that moment, everyone understood that something extraordinary had just occurred, a reminder that human talent, emotion, and presence can transform a room, a life, and even the hearts of those who least expect it. The room remained quiet for a long moment after the last note faded. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the music had pulled everyone into a shared breath, a single heartbeat that held all their attention and refused to release it. Even the wealthy man who had made the careless joke that started this evening sat frozen, unable to meet anyone's eyes, yet unable to look away from her either. He felt a strange mix of emotions, shame, surprise, and a deep respect that he could not have anticipated. The caretaker slowly stood from the piano bench. She did not rush. She did not bow. She simply rose with quiet dignity, letting her presence fill the room without a single word. Her hands brushed lightly over the piano as she left, as if saying goodbye to an old friend, a companion that had shared her life in ways no one else had understood. Guests watched, their faces a mixture of awe and humility. Realizing that something remarkable had just happened right before them, whispers began to ripple through the room. "Did you hear that?" one guest asked quietly. She was incredible," another whispered. The wealthy man, still seated, felt the weight of their words, not as gossip, but as acknowledgement. He had not expected to be humbled tonight. He had expected to make a joke and amuse himself in the crowd. Instead, he had witnessed someone quietly but powerfully claim her moment, her space, and her respect. Slowly, people began to rise from their seats. They clapped, softly at first, unsure how to break the spell. Then more confidently as they realized the significance of what they had just experienced. The applause was not loud, raucous, or boastful. It was genuine, heartfelt, and reverent. It was the kind of applause that comes from recognizing not just skill, but character, patience, and courage. It was the kind of applause that said, without words, "We see you. We respect you." The wealthy man finally stood, his face thoughtful, his posture subdued. He approached her cautiously, unsure how to address the woman who had just humbled him and everyone else in the room. I did not expect that," he said quietly. His usual confidence was tempered with a vulnerability that no one had ever seen before. "I was wrong to make that joke. That was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary." The caretaker nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without needing to respond further. There was no anger in her eyes, no gloating. She had not played to prove him wrong. She had played to express herself, to share what had been waiting inside her for years. And now the acknowledgement was offered freely, not demanded. And she accepted it with calm dignity. Guests moved closer, some smiling, some still in awe, offering words of praise and respect. "That was amazing," one woman said softly. "I have never heard anything like it." A man added, "You should play more often." The house, the world, could hear what you have to say. The caretaker simply nodded, grateful for the recognition but not reliant on it. She had played not for the applause but for herself, for the piano, for the truth of her life. The wealthy man stayed close, watching her carefully. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I assumed you were invisible. I assumed this, all of this, was beyond you. I see now how wrong I was. You've shown us something none of us will forget." She did not smile, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in his words. Not because he had been humbled, but because the truth of her talent, patience, and courage had been recognized at last. Over the next few minutes, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Conversations returned, but they were different now. Guests spoke with a new awareness, a new respect. They were no longer thinking only of status, wealth, or appearances. They were thinking of the woman who had played, of the patience it must have taken to live quietly for so many years, of the courage it took to step forward when the world had underestimated her. They had seen the power of quiet presence, of authenticity, and of skill nurtured with love and care.